The Palestinian insurgency in South Lebanon was a conflict initiated by Palestinian militants based in South Lebanon upon Israel since 1968, which evolved into the wider Lebanese Civil War in 1975 and lasted until the expulsion of the Palestinian Liberation Organization from Lebanon in the 1982 Lebanon War.Though the PFLP and some other Palestinian factions continued a low-level military activities against Israel from Lebanese soil. After 1982, the conflict is considered to have shifted from Palestinian-Israeli to Israel-Hezbollah conflict. The South Lebanon insurgency, which peaked through the 1970s, claimed hundreds of Israeli and Palestinian military and civilian lives, and is considered among the key elements to starting the Lebanese Civil War. History. Plo Militancy begins. From 1968 onwards, the Palestinian Liberation Organization began conducting raids from Lebanon into Israel, and Israel began making retaliatory raids into Lebanon and encouraged the Lebanese people to themselves deal with the Fedayeen. After an Israeli airline was machine-gunned by Palestinian militants at Athens airport, Israel bombed the Beirut International Airport in retaliation, destroying 13 civilian aircraft. The unarmed citizenry could not expel the armed foreigners, while the Lebanese army was too weak militarily and politically. The Palestinian camps came under Palestinian control after a series of clashes in 1968 and 1969 between the Lebanese military and the emerging Palestinian guerrilla forces. In 1969, the Cairo Agreement guaranteed refugees the right to work, to form self-governing committees, and to engage in armed struggle. The Palestinian resistance movement assumed daily management of the refugee camps, providing security as well as a wide variety of health, educational, and social services. On 8 May 1970, a PLO faction called the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine crossed into Israel and carried out the Avivim school bus massacre, Black September, and relocation to South Lebanon. In 1970, the PLO attempted to overthrow a reigning monarch, King Hussein of Jordan, and following his quashing of the rebellion in what Arab historians call Black September, the PLO leadership and the troops fled from Jordan to Syria and finally Lebanon, where cross-border violence increased. Insurgency peaked through 1970s with headquarters moved to Beirut. PLO factions recruited new members from the Palestinian refugee camps. South Lebanon was nicknamed Fate Island due to the predominance there of Yasser Arafat's Fatah organization. With its own army operating freely in Lebanon, the PLO had created a state within a state. By 1975, more than 300,000 Palestinian displaced persons lived in Lebanon, aside being used as an operation base for raids on Israel and against Israeli institutions across the world. The PLO and other Palestinian militant organizations also began a series of airplane hijack operations, targeting Israeli and international flights, carrying Israelis and Jews. The more profound effect on Lebanon was destabilization and increasing sectarian strife, which would eventually deteriorate into a full-blown civil war. In reaction to the 1972 Munich massacre, Israel carried out Operation Spring of Youth. Members of Israel's elite special forces landed by boat in Lebanon on 9 April 1973, and with the aid of Israeli intelligence agents, infiltrated the PLO headquarters in Beirut and assassinated several members of its leadership. In 1974, the PLO altered its focus to include political elements necessarily for a dialogue with Israel. Those who insisted on a military solution left to form the Rejectionist Front, and Yasser Arafat took over the PLO leadership role. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, General Command, which split from the PLO in 1974, carried out the Kiryat Shmona massacre in April of that year. In May 1974, the DFLP crossed again into Israel and carried out the Milot massacre. The Lebanese Civil War. The Lebanese Civil War was a complex conflict in the form of various factions and shifting alliances between and among Lebanese Maronite Catholics, Lebanese Muslims, Palestinians, Lebanese Druze, and other non-sectarian groups. Governmental power had been allotted among the different religious groups by the National Pact based partially on the results of the 1932 census. Changes in demographics and increased feelings of deprivation by certain ethnic groups, as well as Israeli-Palestinian clashes in the south of the county, all contributed to the outbreak of the Lebanese Civil War. Beginning in May 1976, Israel supplied the Maronite militias, including the Lebanese forces, led by Bachir Gemayel, with arms, tanks, and military advisors. The border between Israel and Lebanon was at this time nicknamed the Good Fence, fearing loss of commercial access to the port of Beirut. In June 1976, Syria intervened in the civil war to support the Maronite-dominated government, and by October had 40,000 troops stationed within Lebanon. The following year, however, Syria switched sides and began supporting the Palestinians. On the 11th of March 1978, 11 PLO militants made a sea landing in Haifa, Israel, where they hijacked a bus full of people, killing those on board in what is known as the Coastal Road Massacre. By the end of the day, 9 hijackers and 37 Israeli civilians were killed. In response, on the 14th of March 1978, Israel launched Operation Litani, occupying southern Lebanon, except for the city of Tyre, with 25,000 troops. The objective was to push the PLO away from the border and bolster a Lebanese Christian militia allied with Israel, the South Lebanese Army. On the 22nd of April 1979, Samir Kuntwa and 3 other members of the Palestinian Liberation Front, a sometimes faction of the PLO, landed in Natharia, Israel from Tyre, Lebanon by boat. After killing a police officer who had discovered the presence, they took a father and his daughter hostage in an apartment building. After fleeing with the hostages from police back to the beach, a shootout killed 1 policeman and 2 of the militants. Kuntwa then executed the hostages before he and the remaining invader were captured. In April 1981, the United States tried to broker a ceasefire in southern Lebanon among Israel, Syria and the PLO. In July 1981, Israel responded to PLO rocket attacks on northern Israeli settlements by bombing PLO encampments in southern Lebanon. United States envoy Philip Habib eventually negotiated a shaky ceasefire that was monitored by UNIFIL. The 1982 War. The 1982 Lebanon War began on 6 June 1982, when Israel broke the 1981 ceasefire agreement and invaded Lebanon in a misdirected retaliation over the assassination attempt by on Shlomo Arga, the Israeli ambassador to the UK, rather than directing the retaliation upon the few culprits of the failed assassination attempt. Israelis instead targeted the entire population of Palestinians in the Palestinian Liberation Organization who were not involved in the assassination attempt. As the Israeli army laid siege to Beirut, military bases and refugee camps were destroyed and over 17,000 Lebanese were killed. During the war, fighting also occurred between Israel and Syria. The United States, fearing a widening conflict and the prestige the siege was giving PLO leader Yasser Arafat, got all sides to agree to a ceasefire and terms for the PLO's withdrawal on the 12th of August. The predominantly Muslim multinational force in Lebanon arrived to keep the peace and ensure PLO withdrawal. Arafat retreated from Beirut on the 30th of August 1982 and settled in Tunisia. Aftermath: PLO relocation to Tunisia and conflict with Hezbollah. The 1982 Israeli invasion resulted in the Palestinian Liberation Organization's departure from Lebanon to Tunisia. The creation of security zone in South Lebanon has benefited civilian Israeli population as Galilee suffered lesser violent attacks than previously by PLO in the 1970s. Despite this Israeli success in eradicating PLO bases and partial withdrawal in 1985, the Israeli invasion had actually increased the severity of conflict with local Lebanese militias and resulted in the consolidation of several local Shia Muslim movements in Lebanon, including Hezbollah and Amal, from a previously unorganized guerrilla movement in the south. Over the years, military casualties of both sides grew higher as both parties used more modern weaponry, and Hezbollah progressed in its tactics. By the early 1990s, Hezbollah, with support from Syria and Iran, emerged as the leading group and military power, monopolizing the directorship of the guerrilla activity in South Lebanon. The relocation of PLO bases to Tunisia resulted in deterioration of the Israeli-Tunisian ties, which had previously considered relatively tolerant.